Welcome back to the 10-Minute Podcast and our final polling update before the 2024 Election Day. Before we get into the polls, we want to remind you all to take all of this information with a grain of salt. In 2016, the polls were off. In 2020, the polls also underestimated certain factors in the election. And in 2022, the polls also were off. Be aware that all of this information is not final and it's not a guarantee of who's going to win and who's going to lose, especially with how close this election is. Let's get into it. National polling. US Today reports nationally Trump and Harris are tied, both getting support from 49% of registered voters in a new poll released Sunday by NBC News. The poll of 1,000 registered voters was conducted October 30th to November 2nd, with a margin of error of plus or minus 3.10 points. Only 2% of voters polled in the head-to-head matchup said they were unsure of who to vote for. According to the same article, a national poll of likely voters from Emerson College found that Trump and Harris had 49% support each among U.S. voters. The poll also found that 1% support a third-party candidate and 1% are still undecided just 2 days before Election Day. However, that polling did not take into consideration the Electoral College. It was based solely on the national popular vote. According to the current 270 to win polling average, Harris leads barely with 48.4% to Trump's 47.2%, giving Harris a 1.2% lead. Forbes is saying that Harris leads Trump 49% to 48% with likely voters. In the Harris x Forbes poll, which was taken between Wednesday and Friday and has a margin of error of 1 point, which the poll is in 49 to 48. Now, all of these polls are either tied or extremely close. That may give you the impression that this election, this race, is going to be really, really close. However, that's not exactly the case. New York Times is reporting, quote, some late shifts, but polls remain closest they've ever been. The polls tend to err as a group in one direction or the other, so a fairly decisive win by either candidate is still possible. That is to say that even though the polling is really, really close, we could still see Kamala Harris win well over 270 Electoral College votes, beating Trump, or we could see Trump win well over 270 votes. He could win over 300 Electoral College votes in his victory against Kamala Harris. So it could go either way, and it could go pretty decisively in either direction. Let's look at some key state polling now. So according to 270 to win presidential election polls, in Pennsylvania, we see it is a tie with 48.2% to 48.2%. This is the average of 25 polls. The last poll was conducted on November the 4th. Nevada, Trump is up 0.6%. He's at 48.2% out of 47.6%. That's the average of 13 polls, and again, the last poll was conducted on November the 4th. In Wisconsin, Harris is up 1.1%. In Georgia, Trump is up 1.2%. So some of these key states, it's very, very close. Once again, we see in North Carolina, Trump is up only 1.3%, 48.6% to Harris's 47.3%. Arizona, we see Trump up 1.6%, 48.4% to Kamala's 46.8%. This is the average of 17 polls. In Michigan, we see Harris leading 1.8%. In Iowa, we see Trump leading 4.7%. Now, Iowa's been interesting. There was a kind of a groundbreaking poll that came out this week that had Harris actually up 47 to 44%, which would be a decisive, if Kamala Harris were to win Iowa, it would be a decisive and important key victory for her in gaining those Electoral College votes. Kansas, Trump is up 5%. New Hampshire, Harris is up 5%. Virginia, which some conservative Republicans have been saying is a bit of a toss-up, Harris is leading 5.8% in the average of 5 polls. She's at 49.2%, almost 50% to Trump's 43.4%. Now, the state of Florida, Trump is leading only 6.2%, 51.1% to Kamala's 44.9%. So he does have over 51% in the average of 8 polls. Now, despite Democrats' best efforts in the state of Texas, Trump is leading 7.4%, 51.8% to Harris's 44.4%. So Trump is leading in Texas. In New York, despite what Vivek Ramaswamy might say, Harris is leading 17.6%. The average of 3 polls, she's leading 57.3% to Trump's 39.7%. It's a pretty concisive lead for Kamala Harris's campaign. New York might not be the swing state that conservatives might have you believe. However, because polling has been so close over the last few months, it's possible we'll see some surprising upsets in some of these states. We'll have to wait and see which way they go during this election. Let's move on to Senate and House news. The Guardian says, quote, polls on U.S. House and Senate races paint a worrying picture for Democrats. Numbers reflect a chilling reality for left-leaning Americans. Republicans have a decent shot at winning full control of Congress. However, when we look at some polling for the Senate, we see 34 seats are up, and the Democratic Party is leading 28 of those 34 seats. Now, you have to keep in mind that many of those are incumbent leading. Let's look at when do voting polls close on Election Day. The New York Times is reporting at this. We're going to take a look at an article from The Guardian reporting on this. 6 p.m., polls are going to begin to close. We'll see Kentucky and Indiana close. Both of those states are pretty locked down in terms of going towards the Republican vote. 7 p.m., we'll see 6 states be fully closed, including the state of Georgia for voting. 7:30, we'll see polls close in North Carolina, Ohio, and West Virginia. 8 p.m., we're going to see polls close in 16 states, including Pennsylvania, a key battleground state. We talked about earlier the state's currently tied in terms of polling numbers, so we'll see how that shakes out. By 9 p.m., we'll see polls fully close in 15 states, including Michigan and Wisconsin, some more of the key battleground states. And then by 10 p.m., polls fully close in Nevada, Montana, and Utah. 11, polls fully close in 4 states, including California, and so on throughout the night. But some of those key battleground states, polls are going to be closing early on, and hopefully we'll get a look to see which ways some of those states are going to be going. All right, that's all the time we have for this episode. Make sure you vote. Your voice matters. Follow us, Politics for Teens, on social media. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. And make sure you leave us a comment. Let us know how we're doing with nonpartisan education and media. And we will see you next time on the 10-Minute Podcast.